Good afternoon. My name is Christina Lewicki. As an Associate Director of the Ukrainian Institute of America, I'd like to welcome you to a program focused on Ukraine's economy and business sector. The Ukrainian Institute remains committed to the mission of educating the public about Ukraine and to highlighting timely topics of interest, including the repercussions of the war on all aspects of life in Ukraine. This webinar, Lessons from Lego, Modularity and the Megaproject of Rebuilding Ukraine, was inspired by a new book, How Big Things Get Done, written by Bent Flyvbjerg, one of our two guests this afternoon. Bent memorably finds a solution to building big in the iconic toy Lego. Now, many of us who played with Legos as children would likely agree with Bent's assessment when he writes, "It's remarkable what you can do with blocks of Lego." But Bent puts Legos to work in a way that raises the statement to a whole new level. Bent's book is a comprehensive study of the drivers of successful building projects, but particularly for the purposes of this webinar, the huge projects, the expensive and complex projects, projects on the horrific scale of rebuilding entirely destroyed cities and towns, the mega projects, as he would call them. One of the main drivers of building project success that I believe Bent will discuss today is also the reason why planning the rebuilding of Ukraine is a timely topic, one that will link Ukraine's present with its future. I'd like to just briefly introduce our speakers. Bent Flyvbjerg is the first BT inaugural chair of major program management at Oxford University's Said Business School and the Willem Kahn Rasmussen Professor and Chair in Major Program Management at the IT University of Copenhagen. He is the most cited scholar in the world in project management and included on Stanford University's prestigious list of top 2% of most cited scholars in the world. Professor Flyvbjerg has pioneered research in behavioral science, including power bias, strategic misrepresentation, optimism bias, the planning fallacy, and reference class forecasting. He is the founder and co-founder of a dozen highly successful research groups, degree programs, and startups, latest at Oxford and ITU. Bent Flyvbjerg is also a senior advisor to governments and businesses around the world, including 10 Downing Street, the US and Chinese governments, and several Fortune 500 companies. He is the founding chair of Oxford Global Projects. Bent is the author or editor of 10 books and over 250 papers translated into 20 languages. The full title of his latest book is How Big Things Get Done, the surprising factors that determine the fate of every project, from home renovations to space exploration and everything in between, which was co-written with Dan Gardner. It was released just last month to wide acclaim. The Wall Street Journal called it a seminal book on project management and one that every legislator, city council member, and corporate executive ought to read. Bent is joined today by Rita McGrath. Rita is a top expert on strategy and innovation, consistently ranked among the top 10 management thinkers in the world. Rita was ranked #1 for strategy by Thinkers 50. Her emphasis is on developing sound strategy in volatile and uncertain environments. Rita joined the faculty at Columbia Business School in 1993, where she continues to be a professor, and she has lectured at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. She is a best-selling author and recently began an innovation platform called Valise that helps companies build sustainable, innovative capabilities. Bent and Rita, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Yeah, a pleasure to be here. So, Bent, I thought we would start the conversation again by maybe just for those that aren't familiar with it, summarizing some of the key themes from your book, which I'm a super fangirl of. I really like the book a lot. And I can't believe it took as long as it did for me to find you, because our research really converges around this idea of how you can make sense of an uncertain future and how you kind of overcome biases that are very likely to be present in the planning process. So maybe if you wouldn't mind, just give us a brief overview of some of the core ideas that you've discovered in your research. And your database is now up to what, 1,400 projects, something like that?
No, actually, over 16,000 projects, and that's the last time I counted, and constantly growing, covering more than 130 countries and all continents except Antarctica. So it's a global database where we study projects all over the world. And some of the patterns we've found, well, one pattern that stands out is what I call the iron law of mega projects, and that is over budget, over time, under benefits, over and over again. And that's the iron law. And just to illustrate with some numbers, only 8.5% of projects are within budget and schedule. So 8.5% are within budget and schedule. Now, if you add benefits, meaning delivering the benefits that was promised at the outset in the business case, only 0.5% of projects are within budget, schedule, and benefits. So it's a massively depressing law in a sense. And at first, we actually, my team and I, we thought maybe this is just because we have a small sample of projects. So we frantically collected data on more projects. But actually, that law has been, written in granite, written in stone since the very first small sample of 258 projects that we studied. This has been very clear. So it's a very clear law. It holds with an enormously high level of statistical significance, as we say. It's a probabilistic law, and it basically means if you're doing major projects, mega projects, like Ukraine will be doing, the odds are against you. Simple as that. From the very start, the odds are against you. It's like if you're going to the casino to play poker. You in order to win the poker game, you need to know what the odds are. And generally, in any game, they are against you, especially if you play it in a bank, because the bank needs to win. Otherwise, the bank wouldn't be there, right? Well, it's the same with mega projects. The odds are against you, and you really need to understand these odds if you are going to succeed with mega projects. So that's actually the first observation, that in rebuilding Ukraine, you really need to understand the odds that you're up against, and only if you do that can you succeed. But you can succeed, and in our book we also emphasize lots of success stories, because they are out there, and there are people and organizations who actually know how to do big projects successfully, and those are the ones we need to learn from.
I totally agree. And this would be a wonderful opportunity to create maybe a bit of a brains trust to support some of the people doing the planning in Ukraine. So people have asked me, like, why are you talking about rebuilding Ukraine? Is it too soon to be doing that? And what your work suggests is it's never too soon to start planning. That it's never, that doing the planning up first, and the phrase that you use is, think slow, then act fast. So maybe elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, we call that the rhythm of project success. Think slow, act fast. That's the key to success. And that's why, like you say, that it's a good idea to start early, so you actually have the time to think. What could easily happen in Ukraine is a rushed effort, where you just let's get the shovels in the ground, let's get things done here. That would be a big mistake. You need to know what you're doing before you start digging, or whatever it is, programming, whatever it is that you're doing or educating. Mm-hmm. So it's a good idea to think before you act. Abraham Lincoln, an early president of the United States, said that if he had 5 minutes to cut down a tree, he would spend 3 minutes sharpening the axe, and only 2 minutes cutting down the tree. So that's and you also know the old saying, like carpenters use, they say, measure twice, cut once.
Exactly.
Meaning that if you only measure once, you probably will have to cut twice, but you want to measure twice, cut once. So that's the kind of diligence you need to put into projects for them to succeed. And if you don't do that, and of course you can avoid it, it's totally possible to plan fast and think fast. But it's not a good idea, and you won't save any time by doing it. Quite the opposite. You will take much longer to do your projects, because all the problems that you ignore by thinking fast, they don't go away. Just like the law of gravity, is there. The law is that if you ignore something, it'll come back to bite you later. It doesn't disappear, by you ignoring it. It'll come back to bite you. It's very clear when we study projects that's how it works.
So one of the biggest factors that lead to the rare successes, and I'd love to talk about some examples there, but one of the big things, and I find this in my own research, is designing projects in such a way that you build in learning, so that you're actually reducing the number of assumptions that you have to make relative to the knowledge that you have. And I talk about this with respect to innovation, but I think mega projects are much the same. It's, you have to really think through what those gnarly issues are. And if every single thing you do is unique, you're doing it for the very first time, there's no learning. And so I think one of the reference to Lego, right, is if you can make a project more modular. So I'll just use a hypothetical for Ukraine. Like, let's say we're rebuilding power plants. And what, to me, your research suggests is find the optimal design for a power plant and then just replicate it everywhere, so that you gain experience and you gain the learning curve that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Exactly. That's the point. And this thing about built-in learning is it cannot be overemphasized, actually. And I would go so far as to say that Ukrainians should stay away from projects that don't have built-in learning, period. Don't do any projects that don't have built-in learning. Only do projects that have built-in learning, because only by doing projects of that kind will you get better at what you are doing, and will you be able to reduce the cost. Otherwise, you'll be doing projects that are hugely expensive every time you do them, because they're unique, they're a one-off, and then you do another one-off. And that's unfortunately very common. It's actually much more common in construction and infrastructure to do projects that don't have built-in learning, where you reinvent the wheel every time, because every building is a little different. Every bridge is a bit different. Every, maybe not road, they actually are kind of modular and therefore also perform pretty well. But every, skyscraper is a bit different, and so on. So it's really important to stay away from that kind of project and that kind of thinking, and do projects like you say, Rita, that have a modular design. And luckily, so I assume that rebuilding the energy infrastructure will be a big issue in Ukraine, and that happens to be a big issue all over the world right now, because we are going through an energy transition that, nowhere in human history have we had a transition at this scale, with the kind of energy we use and how we use the energy and so on. And again, I would say that there are ways of doing energy that are born modular, like solar cells. It's like a cell. It's the module. That's the Lego. And then you put a lot of those Legos. You put them on a panel. Then you have a solar panel, right? And then you put a lot of those panels in an array. Then you have a solar array. Then you put up, hundreds of arrays, and you have a solar farm. And you can build multi-billion-dollar solar farms just like that. It's really easy. It's really fast. It has built-in learning. You already have a lot of accumulated learning from the people before you who did this, that you'll benefit from in terms of a lower price. And when you do it, you will get better at it also in Ukraine. Wind power, same thing, completely modular, not quite as much as solar, but close. It's just like 4 elements. There's a foundation, there's a tower, there's a nacelle, and there are wings that you click onto the nacelle, and bam, you're ready to produce electricity from wind power. At the opposite end of the scale, you have conventional nuclear power, so not small modular reactors, but conventional nuclear power, which has proved to be a headache. And the same with the conventional hydroelectric dams. By all means, we should use whatever nuclear power plants we have, because we need that kind of electricity, and it's good because it's zero carbon, and also hydroelectric power. But if I had to choose, if I was in charge of rebuilding an energy infrastructure in a country like people will be in Ukraine, I would stay away from nuclear power and hydroelectric. I mean, new nuclear power and new hydroelectric, because they don't build well at present, because they don't build like Legos. And I would stay close to anything that built like Legos.
Well, and one of the things you talk about with the modularity principle is advancing the time in which benefits start to be felt. So in which you get revenue, in the case of the Nevada factory that you've written about, when a conventional plan often says, okay, we're going to put all this money in, all these resources in, and we're going to wait 3 years before, or 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever it is, before we start to see any benefit at all. And of course, by that time, things are already obsolete. You're already maintaining something that's had wear and tear, and it's just the wrong wrong way to go about things. And you cautioned very strongly that, build it so you get the benefit as early as you possibly can. And that means modularity, that means reusing designs, it means replicating. So maybe tell us the story of the Madrid Metro, because it's a public sector project. It was managed very well. And I think it brings to life some of these principles you've been talking about.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate what you just said. Getting to the benefits is really, really important. I just want to emphasize that. And this is something that most businesses know. They know they need to get to the cash flow, because otherwise they might be dead, before they get to produce anything. But actually, in the case of Ukraine, it's the same thing, because you need to get the nation going again. So you actually need to get to the benefits fast. You can't wait 5 years, which is actually fast for megaprojects. Wait 5 years. For some megaprojects, it's 10, 15 years. It doesn't work in today's world. Nobody can wait 10, 15 years for hardly anything. Still, sometimes people are forced to do it, and it often doesn't end well, So I would encourage, keep it fast in order to get to the benefits quickly. Sorry about that. Madrid Metro. Yeah, so that's a very interesting case study that we include in the book, that we actually decided, let's find a project that people generally say is impossible to do in a modular fashion. And underground metro is that kind of project. Most people say, as soon as you start digging, forget anything about planning, because you don't know what you're going to find, and it's going to upset you and your plans. And metros are almost 100% underground. The Madrid Metro is more than 90% underground, so very much an underground system. And they did one of the largest expansions ever built outside of China, 130 plus kilometers expansion with 72 stations. So it's major thing, and they decided to do this, within a short period of time, because they needed it. The city needed it. And they decided to think in terms of Legos, modularity. And they decided, let's build the same station 72 times instead of building 72 different stations, which is actually the common thing, with metro. You get different architects on the different stations, and in some places you even make them into monuments. You say, let's get the best architects in the world, and you can see things like that in Stockholm, in Moscow. You can see it in London, close to where I am right now. I'm in Oxford, and so this is not so unusual, to try to make a big deal of every station. Madrid said, no way, we're doing the opposite. Each station is going to be the same. It's going to be a nice, roomy, functional station that is easy to move around. There's a lot of space, not like squeezing around each other like you do in London and New York. We want the spacious. Madrid is a very spacious city. We want the same spaciousness in the metro. And they designed one station, and they are using simple cut and cover methods. So digging a big hole and then putting in the station and covering the hole again. And they learned from every station, like you talked about. The learning was built in. The first station was probably, a bit of a learning curve, but the second station a bit easier. The third station even easier than that. And then it was smooth sailing, like popping out one station after another. Okay, that's the stations taken care of. Then you need the track between the stations. And they decided, they thought something that I don't know that anybody had thought of before. They asked themselves the question: what is the optimal length of one tunnel boring machine with one tunnel boring team on it? What's the optimal length that they can bore, in the most efficient manner, until we get to returning economies of scale? And they found that this was between 6,000 to 8,000 meters, so 6 to 8 kilometers for one tunnel boring machine and one team. Now, they were obviously building a lot more than 8 kilometers or 6 kilometers. So they would just get in for whatever the piece of the expansion they were building right now, they would get in as many teams as were needed, to build them, and they would just construct in parallel. So they wouldn't have the same team. That it's more normal to just get 1 or 2 boring machines, and then you just have them drill along until you're finished. And that might easily take 10 years. So for instance, in my hometown, Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Metro just built an expansion, and it's only 10, 12 kilometers, something like that. It took 10 years. because they didn't build it like Lego. They didn't do what they did in Madrid. And by the way, it also cost twice as much per kilometer, per mile as Madrid.
My second home in New York, the Second Avenue subway, I think it cost something like $9 billion.
Yeah,
ridiculous.
That's one of the most expensive pieces of subway ever built. That's the diametrical opposite to what we're talking about in Madrid, you know. In Madrid, they got all these teams going, and they built it the first half in 4 years, and then they built the second half in 4 years, which is twice as fast as your average speed of building metro. And they also built it, like I said, at half the price. So half the price of the average metro. So half the price, twice the cost. That is clear language. That's pretty clear language. Now, that's the way, if you're going to build metro in Ukraine, drop me an email and I put you in contact with the right people in Madrid, and they'll come to Ukraine and tell you how you can do it at half the price of what anybody else will tell you, and twice as fast, just what you need.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing that they did that was great was they didn't do bleeding edge technology. And I think this is a big watch out for our colleagues in Ukraine, which is, we're always tempted to throw the latest and greatest and most significant new technology at problems. But, new technology is new. It hasn't really been proven yet. It hasn't been debugged yet. And so the encouragement, and this was part of the Madrid Metro story as well, the encouragement is try to use only things that have been, proven and work well in the kinds of settings you're aiming to build on.
I think that's a really important point, at least as important as doing it in modular terms, I would say. That's just the way you've got to do it. Use existing technology, and they decided to do that in Madrid. Stay away from new technology, but that's actually the opposite of what you will often hear. The engineers always want to do something that is innovative, right? That's like the nature of engineers, and you can't blame them for that. I mean, that's their job to develop new technology. But hey, I don't want them to do it for my money. I want them to come with their existing technology and deliver that, and then go somewhere else and develop the new technology. That's what I recommend for Ukraine too. You will have a lot of teams coming in, engineers, and saying, hey, you have a fantastic chance to try this brand new technology now, and you will be first in the world, biggest in the world, fastest in the world, or deepest in the world, or tallest in the world, whatever. Stay away from that. This should be red warning signs going off from anybody who's responsible for rebuilding Ukraine, that this is what they shouldn't do, and they should do what they did in Madrid, use existing technology. Another thing they did was avoid conflicts. So they said no lawsuits. So they had these like 4 or 5 heuristics that they work by, like go modular, go fast, use existing technology, and then no lawsuits. Because the people who were in charge of this, they were really, old hands in the construction business, and they know that it's one of the most, there's just a lot of suing going on in the construction industry. It's the way the contracts are written and so on, that people try to push risk between them. And so the risk allocation is very difficult to get right in contracts. And that ends up resulting in people pushing the risk and therefore the cost between them. And in Madrid, they decided we don't want that. We are going to take the risk, and if there's any conflict, we'll settle it. We don't want lawsuits, because there'll only be one winner with lawsuits. That's going to be the lawyers, and we are going to lose, and whoever we are suing or they're suing us, they're also going to lose. So they didn't do that, and that was also one of the reasons that they were able to do it fast and cheap.
So this really brings us to the human side of a lot of these. And in your database, you found just amazing stories of people, knowingly saying what a project would cost, fully knowing that that's the only way they're going to get it approved, and that it's going to actually be a lot more expensive. People pushing the start dates of projects for political gain. Of course, the dark side of corruption. How are some ways that the successful leaders have mitigated against these very predictable human problems?
They first of all, they know about these things, so they're experienced. We emphasize experience a lot in the book, that you really need to be experienced. And that's another piece of advice for Ukraine. Only hire experienced people. Don't get any rookies that don't know how to do this. You don't want to spend your money on other people learning on your projects. You want people who are experienced, who can actually do what they are supposed to do. So that's really important, to get the people who have that kind of experience.
I also think there's a question of really being aware of what's motivating the different parties in the negotiations that are sure to follow. Like what are they really trying to accomplish? You know, is it something for themselves personally, or are they genuinely contributing towards a result for the country as a whole? I think some very important and tough conversations have to be had. And I know this is a big topic of conversation in Ukraine about, how do we make sure that the money just doesn't get shuffled off into somebody's pocket?
Yeah. So the thing you mentioned about people misrepresenting the business case, we call that strategic misrepresentation. And I'm sure I can say from my experience, there's going to be a lot of that in Ukraine, because it's everywhere. And it's something to be aware of. That's the first prerequisite to actually being able to curb it, that you're aware that this is going to happen. And there are ways where you can identify this, because, if some business cases and some offers just look too good to be true, and that's probably because they are, And we have actually, by using our data, we are able to benchmark, business cases and proposals and so on, in terms of how realistic are they. We can actually do it to the probability. We can say that this proposal is 50% likely to be possible to be implemented, and this one is 80%. This one is only 10%, and so on. By a method that we have developed. So that's one thing we do. We screen projects like that in order to decide whether they are too good to be true. And if they're too good to be true, we advise clients to stop them. Don't do it, because it's not realistic.
So one of the techniques you used with great effect is called reference point forecasting. And I think that's what you were alluding to, which is, everybody comes in and says, oh, my project is unique. This has never been done before. And you'll hear a lot of that, I suspect, in Ukraine, because, it's been a number of decades since we've had to massively rebuild a country on that scale. But there's no such thing. There's just no such thing as a project that's unique in every single aspect. There may be some things that are unusual, but it's a bit like your example of the metro, right? Which is, there's always some element of a project that's similar to something someone's done before. And that a lot of that's in your database.
Yeah, that is true. I've actually been surprised to see that reference class forecasting is one of the things that people take away from the book. So I consider this is just a technique that we developed, which is a very useful forecasting method. Actually, other people have studied it independently, and it has been independently verified several times to be the most reliable forecasting technique out there. You can't beat it, at least not with anything that is around right now. I'm not saying that it can never be beaten, but right now, when you test this method against other methods, this is the one that is the most accurate, because it actually takes into account the famous or infamous unknown unknowns, and this is the secret to why it's more accurate than other methods. Yeah. But apparently people really like this, we explain it with some very down-to-earth examples of very different kinds, like writing a book, doing a skyscraper, and things like that, or renovating your home. Also, is one of the examples we use.
So one of the things that we all fall victim to is excessively optimistic beliefs in how quickly something can get done or how much it'll cost. And just what reference class forecasting does is it says, well, let's look at, let's say you're doing a home renovation. Well, let's look at 10 similar home renovations and see how long it took and how much it cost. And that'll at least give you a range of possibilities.
Yeah.
And it does, what I like about it is it creates some realism around the projections that get made, because, we're optimistic creatures by nature, and that's not that bad. Nothing would ever happen in the world if we didn't have optimism, but let's temper that optimism with a little wisdom. Is, I guess, how I would frame it.
Exactly. I mean, I think optimism is a great thing. We wouldn't be able to do anything without it. And I think we need a lot of optimism to rebuild Ukraine, for sure. But what I like about the project leaders that I work with and that I research is that they have this very attractive combination of hyper-realism and can-do optimism. So they are at the same time hyper-realistic about how the world works, and at the same time they are can-do optimistic about that they can actually make a change and make their project succeed in that world. And that's what I think you need. You will not succeed if you're not hyper-realistic about how the world works. You will also not succeed if you don't have the optimism that you can actually go out there and deliver what it is that you plan to deliver.
And I mean, it's going to be emotionally very difficult. I mean, people look at the, just the destruction and memories and lives lost, and, all that is just horrible. But I think you can bring a sense of optimism to it. And you were involved, as I understand, with the rebuilding of Kosovo. And I wonder if there are any lessons from that experience that might be relevant to what's going on in Ukraine.
Well, Kosovo obviously is very different, or was very different, and still is very different from Ukraine. It's much smaller. They were in a different situation. They were like a region of a country that became, they separated or wanted to separate, and then they were put into protection by the United Nations, and eventually they succeeded in separating. So there we actually had to build things from scratch, which is not the case in Ukraine. You had to build the laws. So one of the things I was involved in is to write up the planning and environmental laws for the country, working directly for the Minister of the Environment in Kosovo. So writing up the laws. Also, since it had been a province of another country, a lot of the things that they needed to have in Kosovo was actually located in the capital of the other country, and they needed to develop these things. So, for instance, they didn't have a master's degree in the area, of planning and environmental management. So I helped them develop education, a master's program for that at the Pristina University, and things like that. So basically developing the governance structure and the educational structure that was needed for my area of competence. What we can learn from that is that it's possible. I also think one thing to learn is that it's actually good to have a strong partner, like Kosovo had a strong partner in the United Nations. And I think that Ukraine can get an even stronger partner, because it's not a secret that the United Nations is not the most effective organization in the world. And even though the EU also has detractors on that account, I would say that the EU is probably more effective than the United Nations. So already there, I would say Ukraine has a better point of departure, and it would be a good idea to set it up in a way where there's a very strong partnership with one one strong government entity outside of Ukraine that is actually able to funnel the expertise and help funnel the money into Ukraine in terms of aid and so on. Of course, there'll also be private finance and so on, like in investment banks, etc., that would be interested. But I think this thing about one thing to learn from Kosovo is to partner with a really strong outside organization is invaluable.
Because it also fosters accountability. You're not
exactly
able to hide, by just doing it with yourself. I think that's a great lesson. And we were talking earlier about, although it's terribly sad, the situation in Ukraine also has fabulous opportunities. So let's talk about that. And then I think maybe we'd like to open it up for some questions. I see that there are some questions coming in from our audience.
So in terms of opportunities, I would say that one of the big opportunities, there are many, but one of the biggest that I would mention first is probably the energy transition, and make sure that to use this situation as an opportunity to accelerate the energy transition. So Ukraine will actually be ahead of all other countries in Europe, basically, if they want to, in 10, 15 years. And in my book, that would mean electrify everything and run that electricity on the basis of renewables. That's the way the world is going. Everything is going to be electrified globally, and it's going to be run on the basis of renewables. So that's the formula, and you just need to get that. And like I mentioned earlier, luckily, and this is really good luck. energy is one of the things that comes in a very modular form. So that there you can really accelerate things and get to the benefits very, very quickly. So that's the major thing I would say. But of course, there are many other things. Construction and infrastructure is going to be central because so much have been demolished. And I would say use the opportunity to reshape the construction industry in Ukraine. The construction industry is a pain in most countries. It just doesn't work. And that includes New York, where you are, Rita, and it includes Oxford, where I am. So this is not about Ukraine, having a bad construction industry. Pretty much any place on the planet has a dysfunctional construction industry. And I know that people in the construction industry hate me when I say that, but I'm saying just look at the numbers. I mean, this is like the only sector of the economy that doesn't have increased productivity over time. And you can go all the way back to the 60s and up till today, there is no improvement in productivity. That is a tragedy, actually. And that means we are wasting enormous amounts of money on an ineffective, dysfunctional construction industry. And I'm saying that Ukraine now has a huge opportunity to change and reshape its construction industry by doing what we talked about earlier. Stop doing the projects that don't have built-in learning. And that's almost all construction projects these days, so you need to get rid of a lot of stuff. But the innovative stuff is already out there where you actually have built-in learning, modular construction and so on. And that's what you need to do when you rebuild those schools and those hospitals and those apartment blocks. Make sure you get some of this new high quality modular construction. And a lot of people think maybe especially in Ukraine, they think, oh, modular, it will remind them of really low quality Soviet era buildings. And I'm saying that's a big mistake. Today, modular actually has higher quality because you're building it in factories, and it's possible to build much higher quality in factories than it is to build it on a construction site. And if I had to formulate it in just one metaphor, I would say the metaphor for Ukraine regarding the construction industry should be get rid of the construction sites. It cannot be allowed to exist anymore. It has to be turned into an assembly site. And all the things that are being assembled should be produced in factories where you can produce 24/7 all year round, and you have a nice roof and walls, so you're not out in the cold and the rain and the snow and the mud. So it's much more efficient, which makes it much cheaper. And you just bring these things on site to the assembly sites, and then you assemble things, and that's how you build things. So that's the second big opportunity, and it's huge, and it's something that will benefit Ukraine for the next 50, 100 years, if they get that right. So those are just my two top things, and there are lots of others we can talk about if we have the time.
Those are, well, they could be world leaders. I mean, they could be teaching the rest of the world how to do this.
Yeah,
New York
exactly.
could certainly use to benefit from some lessons.
The United Kingdom too, and Denmark too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, Christina, perhaps we have some questions from our audience that might be good to attend to.
Yes, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This was really insightful and very, very interesting. And I know that we do have questions. We have Lydia Zeininger, our executive director, in the background. I think she's going to read them to us. Great.
Yes, thank you so much.
Get out the screen.
Thank you. So there's one question that dovetails nicely off where you left the discussion here. Maybe I'll start with that, which from Stefan Waite, which says technology and modular construction based on the existing technology of software and robotics require extensive investment on the part of entrepreneurs and organizations. What is your advice to business leaders on how to de-risk investments on that level? So I think you've talked about the deployment, which is great, but what about that other business investment level?
So I have a point of view and you do too, Bent. So why don't you go first and then I'll follow.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question, Stefan. So I actually think that the government needs to take a lead here, and that might be another unique opportunity for Ukraine. The government is going to take a lead on a lot of things anyway, so why not take the lead on construction? And the problem in construction is actually there's not enough demand, and there's not enough reliable demand that the private sector want to risk the investments in the factories and robotics and so on that you mentioned, that you correctly mentioned. And the government has a role to play here, like they played with creating the internet, like they played in creating the PC. You know, the government is. We have lots of examples where it's the government who sort of puts the first stones to get, to get things going. And I think this is also the case in construction. In each country, each state, you know, each city, the government needs to go in and decide how can we help the construction industry by creating a stable demand, say for the next 5 years, that they actually know that there will be enough demand for what they are producing, that they will go out and invest in the factories. That's the kind of positive circle that you need to get going. And if you want to see an industry that has done that, that's the wind industry. They call it ambition loops. And the only reason that we have such a successful wind industry today is that government went in, including the UK government and the Danish government. They went in and say, okay, we are going to guarantee a certain electricity price for a certain number of years. And it's a subsidized electricity price in the beginning, or it was in the beginning. It isn't anymore, but in the beginning it was subsidized because you wouldn't get the industry off the ground if you didn't do it that way. And now we have this hugely successful industry all over the world because of that. We need to do something similar to that in construction, developing ambition loops that will help make the industry comfortable in investing, and then they will produce more at a cheaper price, which means that the government can go in and secure more demand, and then you get that circle going. I'm actually working with the government in Hong Kong on exactly that right now. Hong Kong and Singapore are places to look to if you want to see how you do this in practice.
And I would say I would add Korea with the way that they rolled out the internet in Korea. Fabulous example of how, you know, a private-public partnership created the, I mean, world-class infrastructure years ahead of most of the rest of the world. Just amazing. On the topic of de-risking innovation projects more broadly, there's a technique that I use, which is called discovery-driven planning. And it basically says, before you invest $1, right, let's figure out what are the assumptions that you're making and what are the easy, cheap, efficient ways to test those assumptions. And I'll combine that with an idea from Bent, which is how do you get early to a use case that creates value? So, and I call this a stepping stone strategy, which is if you're opening up a new market, you don't go straight to your ultimate end market. So let's take autonomous vehicles, right? Companies have spent literally $100 billion collectively to produce what? You know, I mean, so much money and so little output. But a stepping stone is an early market that has a real problem that they'll pay to get solved for a real customer. And so it's typically a niche, it's a small market, but if you can use your current technology to help them, it can make a big difference. And that's where you plant your seeds. And so you're de-risking it because you're not exposing yourself to the full investment that would be required to bring the thing to mass scale. You're starting small. And the reason I call it an option is because it's a small investment you're making today that buys you the right to make a bigger investment later. So in the case of autonomous vehicles, where do we see actual successful applications now? In closed systems. So you see them in mining, you know, they're saving human beings in dangerous environments. You see it in the military. So the robots aren't smart enough to take over the whole chain yet. But the robots are smart enough to follow the leader. So what you've got in military supply lines now is a front vehicle with 2 people in it, and then all the others daisy chaining along behind. Now, again, these are not mass markets level for autonomy, but it's a great place to get started. And you can actually make a business case for those small markets. That's how you get going.
Exactly. And the container harbors, same thing. The new container harbors are like that also.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
There are quite a number of questions about the housing market. And again, we've touched on some of this, but people are asking again about this great need. Probably 1 million housing units are necessary. They're questioning, you've touched on public-private partnerships, but the maturity of, or perhaps somewhat immaturity of the Ukrainian government to make some of these large projects happen. And one of the questions is, you know, how do you organize that scale of a project, working in then the policy, legal, funding issues, in addition to the actual brick and mortar stuff?
Do you want to go first, Rita?
Well, I guess my advice, and I'm less experienced at this than Ventus, but I guess where I would start is don't go it alone. You know, these problems have been confronted before. There are a wealth of resources that you can turn to in terms of like optimal templates and designs for how to do this. So, and you know, the world really wants to help. So I would say don't feel you got to have all the answers when you first start. Be open to getting help and bring in the talent that knows how to do these things would be where I'm leading.
Yeah, and I would say make sure that the market is involved somehow, that the market takes care of this. So there's going to be some kind of public-private partnership, you know, but it has to be designed in a way where it's really effective in delivering what needs to be delivered, and where it doesn't become some kind of lucrative gig for the private sector, which has happened with some public-private partnerships. So it's important to get people in who are used to designing public-private partnerships, and you know, have them design whatever contracts there are going to be between the public sector and the private sector. But there's no way of doing this without bringing in the private sector, I would think. And but it sounds like you know, a fantastic thing, you know, to build 1 million houses, a fantastic thing to do what we are talking about, really revolutionize construction and do it differently, getting high quality housing, you know, that people are really going to be happy to live in. That can be done.
Yeah, and let me build on that with kind of a vision that's a little bit farther afield, but I think it's part of this conversation. And this is building on the work of Carlota Perez, who you may be familiar with, Ben, but she basically argues that anytime we have one of these huge transitions, and digital and energy are two that we're kind of going through right now, that there's this predictable pattern that capital initially gets entranced by this. Money flows in, it builds a bubble, and then eventually the bubble bursts, but it leaves behind the infrastructure on which the next generation of technology and investment can be built. And what happens then is the capital moves from this sort of casino economy part where it's happening right now, and it goes into productive capital. And so you saw it after World War II when capital really went into, certainly in America, in much of Europe, the suburbanization, the good life based on the consumption of fossil fuel, right? And what Carlotta's suggesting we might be able to build now is this transition from car dependent, you know, fossil fuel dependent living to communities, which can be much more circular, which can be walkable, bikeable, you know, whatever. And you've got an opportunity, I think, to really rethink what does a good life look like? And her argument would be it's going to be much less about consumption, you know, extraction, usage, waste, and much more about circularity and much more about experiences rather than products, for example. And so I'd have some kind of framework in your mind about what does that look like? What does a good life and a good society look like? Because the opportunity is there.
Yeah, and again, this would be one of the really big opportunities by being in the situation that Ukraine is in and will be in, you know, that they can go much further with this than any other country, because there will be more of a clean slate, and things need to be rethought anyway. So why not rethink them in that manner now that we have the chance, instead of doing it in this very incremental fashion that all other countries are forced to do it. Ukraine can make a major leap forward on this right now.
Question I have also about lessons learned from prior mega projects of rebuilding other countries that had high levels of destruction. Any lessons learned from rebuilding Germany and Japan after the Second World War? And I would add a question about how technology can help optimize application of any of those old lessons.
I think that Japan and Germany are the places to look, you know, and not Iraq and Afghanistan, even though there are also lessons there. But the lessons from Japan and Germany are more pertinent to the Ukrainian situation, in my view. Obviously and luckily, you know, Ukraine is not going to be in as bad a situation as Germany was, and the rebuilding can probably go much faster than it did in Germany. But the Marshall Plan was a great idea, and like Rita said before, make sure not to build this on loans, make sure to build this on aid and collaboration with other countries. And investments, that for people who want to invest in Ukraine, that would be the way to go. And that's actually the way it happened in Germany. So that's a big lesson to learn from Germany. I think the Marshall Plan is generally considered very successful. So that's something to look at. That's what you want. You want a success for sure. And it would just be too painful and too tragic to see that first there's a war and then there's another tragedy, in rebuilding the country. That's simply not acceptable. And it doesn't have to be like that. We know good examples, and Germany is one of them. Technology, well, obviously today we have much better technology than when Germany was being rebuilt. So by all means, use technology wherever you can. But like we talked about before, be careful about this thing about taking the newest technology or becoming sort of that you're the ones that are going to be trying out the new technology, and then other people will learn from you. That's not a good idea. So you want new technology, but not too new technology. But there's a lot of technology that is new, but not too new. So there's a lot to choose from there, and it can be leveraged to design and deliver a much more efficient reconstruction of Ukraine than what we saw in Germany. Rita, over to you.
Yeah, so I would just echo what you said about the Marshall Plan. I won't repeat that, but back on the modularity theme, one of the companies I work for is a Finnish company called Kone. And what Kone's done is actually create digital avatars for all the buildings that they work with. They make elevators and escalators and doors. And if you go on their website, you can actually download actual blueprints of what your elevator or escalator or whatever might look like. And you can play with them as much as you want before you've built anything, right? So you can iterate on the design as much as you want. They do it for free, by the way, so you don't have to pay anything. You don't even have to create an account. You can just download these blueprints for things. And they ask you some basic questions, how tall are your ceilings? What are your constraints? And then the machine knows enough to kind of build around it. So one of the things I would really advise is using those kinds of technologies to prototype as much as you can before you metaphorically stick a shovel in the ground. And it's kind of a modern day version, Bent, of the example of the Empire State Building that you use in the book, which is, people knew before they even started where every rivet was going to go, how many beams they needed, and as they gained experience building the building, they would do 1 floor a day, then it was 2 a day, then it was 5 a day, and so it'd get much better. So the ability to mock up and prototype, and by the way, don't leave out your communities, right? Don't mean this, planners don't know everything and they don't think of everything. And so if you build these virtual models of what your proposed plans could be, you can actually now get community input and much more buy-in, right? And much more agreement about this being the right way forward. And I'm thinking, Bent, also of the metro in Madrid, where they actually got the communities to say, yes, we'll do the drill all night long because we want our benefits 4 years earlier, right? And so there was a huge engagement of all the stakeholders, and I think that's absolutely critical. So we've talked about public-private partnership, but the communities matter a lot, and they're the ones that are going to have to do the hard part of building up the human capital that you'll need for the future.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that example from Madrid when you mentioned it. Involving the communities is hugely important. The other thing that I thought when you were speaking is about the Kone. I actually have a Kone elevator right behind this wall. And
one of my favorite clients ever.
Yeah, so it's not an alien thing, but anyways, this thing about building things on the computer before you build them in reality, which is really what you're talking about. So you build the elevator system on the computer before you build it in reality. That's really the way forward. And you can save so much money and time on that. And this is, we give several examples of that in the book of people who are doing that, in real life, not just like an idea, but actually doing it and succeeding with their projects because they built the project on computers, sometimes several times before they built it in reality. So once you go on the assembly side, you actually know what you're doing because you already did it on the computer. That's another thing that Ukraine will have that Germany didn't have that will make Ukraine more successful than Germany was after the Second World War.
May I follow on to your thoughts on engaging all stakeholders, including community, because that was formulating in my mind while you spoke also. So one of the things that happened surprisingly, or maybe not at the beginning of the full-scale invasion last year, was this civic engagement in Ukraine. And part of the reason they were able to survive in those early days was not because the government was able to deploy defense, but because the country, the population mobilized. Of course, when you're trying to do a mega project, engaging more people can create chaos. How does one find the balance to engage stakeholders and public, communities, but keep moving at a rapid pace?
Well, I think I'll start with that. I think when it comes to getting people involved, there's sort of two levels, right? There's am I being heard? Is my perspective being accepted and valued? And even if the decision is not the one that I would make, if I feel I've been dealt with fairly and I feel that the process was transparent and fair, I'm less likely to sort of spring off and create a warring faction. So I think there's the sort of creating places where people can be heard. So let me give an example from a company, and the company's Salesforce. And what they do when they're beginning their planning cycles is the senior team puts together a document that contains their hypotheses about what they think they should be doing in the next planning cycle. And that document is made available to every single employee there who has the option to comment on it. So the comments can run into the thousands of pages. And then they use AI to kind of put them into clusters. And then there's open discussion. There are town halls, there's forums. And then finally, the senior people have the power to make the decision. So they eventually make the decision. And some people will be thrilled and some people will be less than thrilled. But, it's a process where people feel they've been included. And I think with modern technology, there's a lot you can do to get people's voices and find out where the pain points are and find out what the community really does care about.
And I would add to that the key requisite here is that somebody actually is in charge of this. There needs to be somebody who's responsible for engaging the community and the stakeholders, and that has to be a serious job, a well-respected job, and of course staffed by a person or a team rather who know how to do this. This is their area of competence. It's really important, and we have a heuristic in the book that we call make friends and keep them friendly. That's their job. They really need to make friends of the communities as much as possible. But like Rita says, some people will be happy and some will be unhappy about things when you do big things. There's no way around that. But even the people who you make unhappy, it's actually possible to have friendly relations with them. And you need to explain, and sometimes you need to compensate, and given how expensive mega projects are, usually that's a minor thing, to compensate people in the community who are negatively affected. And often it doesn't take a lot. It just takes like a gesture and to show that you care and ask people, hey, how can we help you? Is there anything that we can do for you that will make you less unhappy about what happened? I mean, for the people who are unhappy, and then for the people who are happy, it's easy, of course. But somebody needs to be in charge of that, and we have good examples of that, Madrid being one of them.
Fabulous.
So there's also a thread of questions about corruption, which you've also talked about. Ukraine has some problems in the past, and I think that the administration is trying to address them, but certainly big projects lend themselves to temptation. So one question here is, how would you address the need for robust anti-corruption mechanisms in connection with a lot of this reconstruction? What would be effective and efficient? And interestingly, might blockchain play a role there? Have you run across some of these new technologies in being integrated into big projects?
Rita, do you know about blockchain? Because I don't. I know blockchain, of course, but and I can see how one would link it with corruption because you can track every payment and so on. But I don't know of any system that has been developed specifically for that.
And I don't know either. I know IBM was working on incorporating blockchain in a project management system. I don't know the current status of it. What I would say with corruption in general is anytime you have a lack of transparency, it opens the door to corrupt behavior. So the more visible, the more transparent, the more, open book you can make your dealings, the less likely you are for corrupt actors to be able to get in there. So I think transparency is absolutely key. And whether you use blockchain to achieve that, that might be one approach. But for example, you know, have your negotiations where an impartial observer can be present, you know, make sure that contracts are open and vetted, you know, just kind of basic building blocks of you know, there have to be rules around things, and the rules have to be articulated, visible, documented, you know, contracts have to hold, and so forth. There's a wonderful book by a gentleman named William Baumol that I can highly recommend people look at. And it's called The Free Market Innovation Machine. And in it, he describes how free market capitalist systems need to work in order for people to put their own money at risk. And one of the reasons that they would be reluctant to do that is if there's a suspicion of corruption. You know, if contracts don't hold, if it's an insider job, if someone's, you know, if it's nepotism, and that will depress the wish of people to invest in the country. So I think it's a very clear message. And if you look at a country that's done that really well, I would say Singapore has done it excellently. And that was the brainchild of one man, Lee Kuan, I think his name was. And he looked at Singapore when he came into power. It was very corrupt. It was, you know, just bad behavior, not enough resources. And he said, we're going to put in place a set of rules and laws that will make us the best place in the world to do business. And that was what they stuck with all the way through. Ireland would be another example of a country that very carefully designed their policy systems so that, you know, foreign direct investors felt comfortable coming in.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that you have nations that used to be very corrupt, and then over a very short period of time they become non-corrupt. So this is very encouraging in the sense it shows that it's actually possible to get rid of corruption. Not 100%. I'm from Denmark, and I often meet the misunderstanding that the Scandinavian countries are not corrupt. Let me assure you, they are corrupt. You know, it's just at a different level. It's more hidden and so on. But just to ease everybody's mind, though, there's corruption even in Scandinavia. With construction and infrastructure, it's a problem that all over the world, they are actually the most corrupt sectors in the economy. And I understand that Ukraine actually has had a history of corruption before the war. So if you combine those two things, construction, infrastructure, extra corrupt, and there's a history of corruption, I think this is something to keep an eye on, because there'll be huge opportunities for corruption here. There's going to be so much money involved that anybody who's corrupt will see this as the opportunity for the party of their lifetime. And you don't want that to happen. But the encouraging thing is that it actually is possible to get rid of corruption. I would say that, like Rita, transparency is the most important thing, but also culture. It actually has to be that the population says corruption is not okay. It's just not okay, you know. And if you don't have that culture, it's not going to happen. If you have a culture where you think corruption is actually okay, you're actually pretty cool if you can make your money through corruption, because it means you're not working. You're making free money. Some geographies are like that. If that's the attitude in the culture, you're not going to get rid of corruption. Then it's that culture you need to attack. And a third thing is law. Of course, you need to have laws that make corruption illegal. And then those laws, not least, need to be enforced. If you don't enforce the laws, they're not going to have any impact.
So I see we're just over an hour, so I might add one more question that is a bit more positive than corruption. So another characteristic, I think, of Ukrainians is their creativity. They're incredibly unusual thinkers in a lot of ways. Some of these mega projects, you know, especially if you're trying to be efficient and effective, they could have a tendency to tamp down the creative aspect. How does one try to integrate that? And I think of a project like the Gary project in Bilbao, the Guggenheim, which is obviously revolutionary in so many ways. How can one preserve something interesting and alive in a mega project?
So first, I think that you know, the population in Ukraine has shown already that they're creative. That's beyond doubt, you know, and I'm full of admiration, I have to say, having seen how people have dealt with their situation there. That's really admirable. So I'm not concerned that there won't be creativity in reconstruction of Ukraine. It's very clear there will be. And you're right that we have to be careful not to squash that creativity. And sometimes if you build very big bureaucratic machines, you know, that's not the right environment for creativity. But hey, we've talked about how you do big, small, right? By lots of small things that you replicate with learning. That's very creative, actually. And that would give a lot of room for creativity. So that's the way you do it. You know, you get creative people involved as leaders, like Frank Gehry was on the Guggenheim Bilbao. Then you get a team behind those leaders who get to practice that creativity, and off you go. Rita.
Yeah, I would just add that designers, design thinkers love constraints. They love constraints. I mean, the first thing they'll ask you is, if you're coming to design a project or something, what are the constraints? So Kone will ask you, how tall are your ceilings? What's the material your walls are built of? And so don't think that just because you have constraints, there's no room for creativity. A large part of the design process is saying, here's the unchangeable things we have to deal with. Those are constraints. Here's the things that might be constraints, depending on what decisions we make. And then here's the space you have to play creatively. So I don't think the two are necessarily opposed to each other. I think they can work together really well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. There are more questions, and we will pass those on to our guests. I just want to assure the audience they've been very, very active here. But in the interest of time, we probably should wrap up our discussion for today. Christina?
So let me just offer, if certainly if I can be of help, would love to continue the conversation. I think Bent is in a similar mode, and I certainly see these conversations as opportunities for learning, and hearing what's on people's minds is very, very valuable.
Yeah, I agree. And I also want to thank the audience for the very good questions. Very good question. Thank you so much.
And I was muted. I apologize. We thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to have you back again sometime.
Great. Yeah, keep us informed. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks.
As for us.